Hello, this is Jed Brewer with Below the Line Club and Study Groups. Very nice to have you on our call today. We are going to be talking about how do we harness the power of solar, and is it right for your business? I know there's a lot of a buzz out there about solar. We see it in residential homes and more so out in commercial applications as well. But what is the cost of getting it done? What are potential complications? Has anybody actually done it successfully before? So those will all be some of the things that we'll be talking about here on our webinar today. Really pleased to have two experts in the area. One is Russ Edwards, who's president of Tiger Solar out of Charlottesville, Virginia area. And Tiger Solar is a solar company that goes around to businesses and installs solar. So we'll be speaking a lot from what are the ABCs about putting it in, what are the do's and don'ts about doing it as well. And then following up, we'll have Taylor Sutton, who's the Chief Operating Officer at Tiger Fuel, talking about how he implemented solar in his company. So Tiger Fuel is a study group member, a petroleum marketer, convenience store operator. So he'll describe a little bit why they solarized, how the process went, what would they do again differently, and what would they do the same. So we want this to be a really educational time for you today. We encourage you to ask questions. I've got you on mute, so if you do have a question, please type it into the dialog box that's in your GoToWebinar application. I'll be able to read those questions and I can relay them to Russ and Taylor at the appropriate time. Before we dive in, just real quick more detail about our presenters. So Russ, as I mentioned, is president at Tiger Solar. Tiger Solar recently joined a solar study group that we formed, which we're really excited about, the first solar study group out there. And so he and other non-competing solar companies are sharing ideas about how they can grow their businesses and better serve their customers. And just a little bit about Tiger Solar and Russ. So Russ has been in the industry for about 20 years, and by the industry, I mean construction and now into solar, both construction, contracting, and renewables as well. Prior to being the president at Tiger Solar, he served as senior director of onshore project development at Ørsted North America and vice president of development at Cornell Energy. And as I mentioned, he lives there in Charlottesville. And then Taylor, he's the chief operating officer at Tiger Fuel. But Tiger Fuel is a family-owned petroleum marketing convenience store company out of the Charlottesville area. Taylor is a co-owner of that company along with his brother and his sister. He got into his family's business in 1998 as a 16-year-old, where he was running the cash register at one of the convenience stores that they owned at the time. He went to the University of Virginia, has his bachelor's in environmental sciences from there, and started out hoping to find a career in renewable energy. And then in 2011, returned to his family business and has just been growing through that business since then. In 2017, so about 6 years ago, took over as the chief operating officer for the company. So that's a little bit about our presenters. We're really grateful to them for being on the call. And Russ, I'm going to turn it over to you at this time to tell us a little bit how solar works for building owners like ourselves who are on the call.
Great. Thanks, Jed. You all can see me and Taylor and me. We cannot see you, so I'm just imagining that you're all super excited to be here and are probably like giddy. We're hoping to give you two things today and then leave you with access to us for help in the future if you come across an interest in an opportunity for solar. We are a huge fan of study groups going back a long ways in the Tiger Fuel family, and would like to help you guys wherever you are in your business. So again, my part of it is just to try to give you sort of the basics of solar and how to evaluate it, what to expect in the process, what buildings it would be useful for, what kind of businesses it would be useful for, and a bit of how it works. And then Taylor will come in behind me. We'll have a little bit of Q&A, and then Taylor will come in behind me to give you a customer experience. Tiger Fuel is not only the owner of Tiger Solar, but going back before we were acquired by Tiger Fuel, Tiger Fuel was a customer, and so Taylor is going to give you more in depth about how that process went, why they did it, all of those things. So without further ado, here we go. A little bit about us, what we do, what we don't do. We are 20 years into this business. So the solar part of the company was formed at the end of 2004. We did a lot of our work in residential, and in 2015 began picking up a lot more commercial work, working with small business owners and some large business owners on commercial buildings, churches, schools, institutions, institutional kind of buildings, as well as groups like Tiger Fuel who have gas canopies, or retail shops looking for reducing their costs. We're going to go a little bit into the solar basics, meaning how solar works, how it works both on the grid, on your property, as well as financially how it works. And I'll give you a little bit more about sort of how you would evaluate, or how we would help you evaluate solar for your property. And then lastly, I want to give you a quick rundown on how to go from A to Z with a contractor, a little bit about which contractors to steer toward or steer away from, how to evaluate that. We've already mentioned that we're part of the Tiger Fuel family of brands, and Tiger Fuel goes back to 1982. I hope some of you that are listening know Tiger Fuels from study groups. So one thing that distinguishes our company and other companies like us is that we're a turnkey EPC, an engineering, procurement, and construction company. So we're not a brokerage. We're not developing the project and then going to farm it out or subcontract it to someone else. We've done over 2,000, now 2,100 projects in Virginia, DC, Maryland, Michigan, a few other states. And we really focus on grid-tied systems. And on-site, not virtual, not solar farms that are selling power to some other company, virtually. But we focus on systems that are on-premise and behind the meter. They're grid-tied, meaning that they're not off-grid, a cabin in the woods or a commercial office in the woods. These are all behind-the-meter systems as Tiger Solar expertise. Not terribly helpful, but we've done a lot of work in the Mid-Atlantic, as this map is trying to represent. And we've done a lot of different kind of projects for a lot of different kind of customers. Very large carport canopies, very large warehouse rooftops, flat rooftops, more of that. Schools, churches, which we'll see in a second. This is a different kind of application. A flat roof and a metal roof has a very different kind of attachment process between the panel and the roof, and we'll talk about that a little bit. This is an example of a flat roof where many flat roofs do not have to have the system physically attached. It doesn't have to be mechanically fastened. It can be ballasted or weighted, and that reduces the number of penetrations to very, very, very few. Really, it's just the conduit, the wiring conduit, going from the system down to your electrical room. This is different. This is a little bit up close of a panel system that's attached mechanically on these seams, on the seams of the metal roofing. And this is a slate roof at a very tough angle, but an example of another application. This is for a church in Grand Rapids, Michigan. We not only do large applications, we also do small applications, and part of that is just to communicate with you. No matter if your building property that you're contemplating is enormous or very small, there can be a lot of cost savings and a good investment with solar. Here's one of Tiger Fuel's projects and another one on their washes, and a last one on their canopy. And with that, we'll dive into to more details. So two concepts that are really helpful to understand when it comes to solar, if you're new, especially if you're new to it and you've have any interest, hopefully do if you're here. One is just the concept of renting your power versus owning it. You know that if you're here as a property owner, there can be some advantages to renting a property. Long term, we think there's more advantages to owning that property. That's true for your power production as well. And across the country, utilities have allowed the production of your own power through solar. And we like to help business owners take advantage of that because over the long haul, it will absolutely pay off, just like owning your building instead of renting decade after decade after decade. And that's true whether it's with a cash payment or you're looking at some sort of financing to be able to afford to be able to not have the upfront capital hit. Producing the power yourself long term is frequently, typically, often going to be the better route long term. I'm going to skip through some of these benefits. You all know the benefits of renting your building versus owning the power. I think that's helpful, or we'll just leave it at that for now. The other concept that's really helpful, and this is different across the country, but it's helpful to understand what net metering is. The easiest way to explain it is the old cell phone plans that had rollover minutes. So in many areas of the country, the utility uses what's called net metering, where if you produce a kilowatt hour, you receive a kilowatt hour credit. Now that's not true in every state, that's not true in every locality. In some localities, they have what's called a value of solar. So you produce a kilowatt hour and you get 15 cents, or you get 20 cents, or you get 6 cents, depending on what time of day it is. It's a little more complicated, but it's easiest to start off to say, this is power that's being produced behind the meter. It's either being used locally or injected into the grid, but in either case, if you produce that kilowatt, you get a kilowatt hour of credit. Quickly, to run through a couple of financial scenarios, the reason we focus on small businesses, small to medium businesses for the commercial application of solar is because the finances will make sense. We can typically see a 10 to 15% internal rate of return when we sit down with a building owner and look at a 25-year projection. And the reason we do a 25 years is because the manufacturers of the panels and the inverters of that system, they warranty that system, particularly the panels, will not degrade past 90% of their production. So at year 25, those panels should still be producing only as little as 90%, or they'll still be producing 90% of when they were taken off the rack at the supply house. That's a good deal. If you had an HVAC that was warranted for that long, I think we'd all be happier if it was still producing 90% in 25 years. And there's a couple of ways that we help customers make sense of the financials. So in this scenario, a $100,000 investment on a system is hefty upfront, even though it's going to pay off over the life of the system. And generally, it's going to pay off between 5 to 15 years, just depending on what part of the country you're in. But the economics would produce, in many scenarios, a 10 to 15% IRR. For some building investors, that's way too low. For some building investors, that's wonderful. What happens here is that upfront investment gets reduced 30% by the income tax credit, gets reduced in year one by accelerated depreciation, and that accelerated depreciation will continue in years 2 through 5. The avoided cost, meaning the kilowatt hours you're not paying for in year one, and the net capital cost that's left is just over 50% of the actual project cost. Generally, a construction time is going to be 1 to 4 months, but a total project is going to be 6 to 8 months. I want to introduce to you what a lot of you would be eligible for, which is a significant grant here in the United States from the U.S. Department of Agriculture. The USDA has a REAP grant. It's a very sizable grant. It can pay for up to 50% of solar projects. Not everybody is eligible for it, but if you are in any rural setting, your building probably is. Happy to talk with you about that and give you more details. But in this scenario, $100,000 project cost again gets reduced by the income tax credit, depreciation in year one, accelerated depreciation in year one, and the year one avoided costs. But it also gets reduced by up to 50% if that REAP grant is awarded, reducing your upfront cost after year one to a very slim portion, in this scenario around 5 to 8% of those initial costs. In that scenario, when we look at that, if a building is qualified for a USDA REAP grant, it's not crazy for us to see 20 to 25% IRRs for a 25-year period. It does.
Russ, what would prevent that REAP grant from being awarded?
If you're not qualified as a small business, if you are a nonprofit, if you are not in a USDA rural area. In Virginia, all of Charlottesville, many of our even larger metropolis areas are still in USDA REAP eligible areas. You know, Richmond, for example, is not, and of course, Northern Virginia around DC are not. Hope that helps.
That makes, yeah. And are there state specific grants as well, not just federal? Do you know?
Yeah, that's right. I've tried to keep, for the purpose of our conversation here, at a pretty high level, what would be useful, no matter if you're calling in from whatever part of the country. But in addition to the income tax depreciation, avoided cost, and the REAP grant, some parts of the country have what's called a renewable energy credit or a solar renewable energy credit, and you are actually able to sell an energy credit back to a market for additional income. There are other grants at the state level. There are property tax exemptions at the state level. There are a lot of other factors here that a contractor would work with you on harvesting any and all of those benefits.
And that was going to be a follow-up question I was going to ask. Like, as it relates to contractors, they come in all different shapes and sizes, I'm sure. Are they generally a really good resource for finding out this specific information, or at least should they be if I have the right contractor?
They should be if you have the right contractor. Yeah, and I'd tell most people to, you know, talk to a few, get a good recommendation, find someone if you can that's local, that, you know, has a stake in your market and is interested in improving, you know, living in and improving your market. Some of it is going off a little bit of gut. If you've got a good relationship and sense of transparency, not translucency, but transparency with the contractor, that's really helpful. They shouldn't be pushy. They shouldn't be high pressure. Sometimes they are, and that's unfortunate, but they should be answering every single question you'd like to have answered.
That makes sense. Thanks, Russ.
Yeah, in a lot of ways, this is you know, this is a sizable investment if you're paying for it with cash and not under a financing or a power purchase agreement arrangement. And just like any investment, you want to work with somebody that you trust, know, and you feel like you can communicate really well with. For evaluating your own properties, these are a few things that I would point you to in terms of thinking about your properties. This is not a litmus test, meaning a pass-fail, but this is the bullseye. So you may have a property that doesn't fully fall on one of these categories or have one of these categories. It is probably still worth looking at, but this is the bullseye. Southern exposure, southern facing exposure, no to low shade, which frequently for commercial properties is not an issue. Contiguous square footage, and how much is hard to say, but generally the wider, longer, broader you can have a rooftop or a land beside the building, but a rooftop especially without plumbing pipe penetrations and HVAC equipment or other equipment, or different roof planes, the better. Generally, you're going to look for average to high electrical usage, and if you're a commercial building owner, you probably meet that. But we're also often looking for buildings with low demand charges, meaning if you are paying $10,000 or $20,000 in demand charges on your bill to keep your kilowatt hour at an extremely low rate, that kind of takes you out of the bullseye, but it can still be done. It's just something that we would want to look at because those demand charges can exist out after you go solar, and you wouldn't reap all of the benefits of solar. You do want a long horizon. You know, if you're selling the building this year, you know, probably is not a complication you want to endeavor. And you want to install on roofs with a longer roof life. You're not looking for a roof that needs to be replaced in the next half a decade. And then lastly, oh, sorry for that. Lastly, we're looking for structural soundness, and most buildings built after 1970 or 1980, it's very easy to check that out. Sometimes before then, it's a little more difficult. It's a very low pounds per square foot added to the rooftop, so that is not generally an issue, but it can come up. And I'm not going to go in depth into the process here, but I want to make myself available to any of you that would like to talk about this more after this webinar. But the things that are different about a solar construction project versus any other kind of construction project, are that your financial review on the upfront is really going to happen with that contractor by and large, unless you go out and hire a consultant. And they're going to be digging into some of the electrical usage, your utility rate structure, how are your meters configured on the property? Are they advantageous? Can they be combined in any way? What's the interconnection path? Every utility requires an application for interconnection, much like you have to go through an AHJ county or city inspection electrically or for a building. It is an analogous process, but with the utility. Safety plan really shouldn't be any different from a general contractor. Evaluating as much harvesting of grants and incentives as they can, and then looking at financing and funding options. These are some of the big things that make it different from a typical construction project. And of course, that net metering and permission to operate the system comes from the utility. So there are two permitting applications that you have to go through. One through your AHJ, one through the city or county, and then one through the utility. It's not discretionary. They can't say, at the end of the project, we decided not to turn it on. We get that before we start the project. Those are some key highlights of how it's different than a typical construction project in terms of contracting, planning, doing any kind of feasibility to make sure that if you're doing a renovation, it's all going to shake out, and then doing the building itself. And that's it for me, unless there's questions that I can help answer before we flip over to Taylor.
Russ, one question is, what kind of maintenance is required after these panels are installed? You said they may last for 25 years or possibly more, but tell me a little bit about maintenance.
Yeah, that's a great question, and it ties to the why we think of it and talk about it with our customers as an investment, and in particularly a low risk investment. There are no or very few moving parts to a system like this. The panels do not generally need to be washed. Now, you may have an exception depending on where you are in the country. If you are in a very drought or a very low rainfall climate, or if you're on in an agricultural space or an industrial space where a enormous amount of dust is kicked up. But generally, rain will take care of washing the panels and keeping them producing well, keeping them clear so they can produce well. There is a component called an inverter that basically switches the DC electricity in the panels to an AC so it can be injected into the grid. Those may need replaced in the life of the system, so you want to make sure that those are figured into any sort of cost estimate or long-term financial projection. But the maintenance is really little. Sometimes squirrels can chew through wires. Sometimes your inverter goes offline and needs to be reset. Sometimes the inverter goes bad and needs to be replaced. Generally, warranties will cover replacing an inverter. Of course, it depends on who you're working with and what they buy, but it's very, very low maintenance.
That makes sense, Russ. And then one other question before we move on, but in terms of finding an installer, you mentioned some things that we should look for. Somebody who has knowledge about grants, they should be able to deliver that. Obviously, local was something that you mentioned. They've got experience in your market. But also, you said that you actually install, you do the installation work. You don't just sell it and outsource the installation. Is that something that we should look for? What other things should we look for in an installer?
Those are things I would look for, and it doesn't mean that a developer shop that is, working with you as a customer to develop the project and will go and manage the construction for you. It doesn't mean that that's a bad model. It just means that you want to go in eyes wide open of, who they are, what their model is, and how they're going about it. I would absolutely look for experience. How long have they been serving commercial clients? How long have they been doing construction? Just like you were evaluating any construction firm, who do they think is going to work on the project? Do they have a name? How much experience does that superintendent have? If you were doing $1 million renovation, the same kind of questions that you would ask of those contractors, very similar to what you would ask of a solar company.
Makes sense. Well, thank you so much, Russ. Really appreciate it. Again, for the audience, if you have any questions for Russ, type them into the dialogue box. We can pick them up at the end. For now, we're going to turn over to Taylor Sutton. Taylor, again, the Chief Operating Officer at Tiger Fuel. So he's a petroleum marketer / convenience store operator. We're looking at, I believe, one of their stores there where they put solar panels on. And Taylor's going to talk with us a little bit about their experience actually implementing this and what they learned and what they do differently.
Yeah, thanks, Jen, and Russ for driving here. But yeah, that is one of our stores. It's one of our first solar installation that we did when we rebuilt a store north of Charlottesville and Ruckersville. I think I have one of these same pictures here. We've got a lot of good marketing images out of it. But yeah, that was our maiden voyage in solar. But yeah, I'm just going to talk to you guys a little bit about why we did it, how it went, and what we would do differently next go around. So this first slide is why we did it. This is our main headquarters office. The building on the right is a warehouse, and the building on the left is where I'm currently sitting. And you can see there's arrays on the right, sort of southeast facing portion of the roof, and then on the southernmost piece, just sort of out of sight there. But we just completed that within the last year. It was the end of last summer we got that turned on. But the reason we did it is that we had a ton of large rooftops, especially our canopies. Every gas station is going to have a large flat canopy over the dispensers, fuel pumps, and we have really huge electricity bills at any of our sites. We've got our stores are typically deli stores, which means we've got huge coolers, refrigerators, freezers, all of which are energy hogs, and so we wanted to reduce those costs the best that we could. So that was a pretty easy reason to do it. Another thing is Charlottesville is sort of a progressive, more forward-thinking, more environmentally conscious city, and we wanted to show that we cared about that same things to our customer. And as Jed said, I was an environmental science major at UVA, and I grew up fishing and hunting and spending a lot of time outdoors. Both my father and grandfather were both in the fossil fuel industry, but we're also avid outdoorsmen, so you can be both, even though that seems like a contradiction. But there's also a local group here called the Charlottesville Climate Collaborative, and they have a GBA, is a Green Business Association, that is committed to reducing our carbon emissions by 45% by 2030. So they got together with a bunch of local companies, and we all signed this agreement that we were going to try to do that by 2030. So just sort of be leaders in the local city and economy to try to produce less carbon. And the last thing was diversifying Tiger's offering. So we have always, set propane tanks, delivered propane, heating oil. We've got our gasoline stores, so the C stores selling a lot of gasoline. And we know that there's continuing pressure against the fossil fuel industry, and that as people that want to operate this company and hand it off to future generations, that's not something that's going to be around forever. So we wanted to be part of the renewables landscape, and get into some sustainability business lines that will hopefully have a longer future as fossil fuels start to diminish. So those are some of the reasons why we did it. So we can go to the next one there, Russ. So this is another image of that Ruckersville site. So how did it go? I would say it went really well, and so well that we acquired the company that did this installation for us. So my brother started this discussion when we built this store in 2017. The company was called Alt Energy at the time, and we really enjoyed dealing with a company that does the EPC, engineering, procurement, and construction, just because it simplifies the process, and you know that one person is going to have to deliver what they promise from the initial onset. And so everyone we dealt with on the alt energy side of things was very upfront and honest about what the system would produce, what the system would cost, how the construction would go, all of those things that they could control themselves. So I think that's an added benefit, although it doesn't necessarily mean that the other guys are bad. But my dad always joked that whenever dealing with any sort of vendor or contractor, it's better to just have one neck to choke rather than chasing a bunch of people that could be responsible for the delays you're facing. So that was a good advantage there. As far as the construction went, everything was very smooth there. My first bullet, dealing with the utility, can be painful. Utilities are strange. They're different in every locality, every state. So it's not all of them, but Dominion's the major one here. And they're sort of famous for changing the rules mid-game, which can make some systems not viable, which is kind of scary when you're making a large investment. You don't want to buy a bunch of equipment that you can't use potentially. They can also be slow to approve the job that you want to do, and they can also be slow to let you turn the system on. So I would advocate that anybody that is interested in a solar system, that they would start it right around this time of year, if not November or December, because you're going to be a month or so getting permission from them. You're going to get a month or so doing the construction, then it's probably a month or so getting permission to turn it on. There's nothing worse than having a completed system that's connected and they're ready to go, and it's July and it's cranking, good sun, but you're not getting any credit for that because you're waiting on the utility to give you permission. So that's one thing that I was a little bit frustrated by. But we have 9 systems all together now, and last year we produced 168 megawatts, which equates to about $50,000 worth of electricity. 3 or 4 of those systems only got turned on late summer, so next year we should produce more. We also have a couple of power purchase agreements, PPAs. So those are systems that we own, and we sell the power back to the end user. So that is another option, but not really relevant here for this discussion. The return on investment for our jobs was roughly about 8 or 9 years, and we've been on track with those. I put a system on my house. I just did some quick math while Russ was talking, and I'm on track for about a 9-year payback on that. And not paying any power bills is very rewarding, especially when you're frustrated with the folks that are slowing you down. At least they're not getting any of my personal dough. So that's good that everything has been on track. And I would say that's another thing that a company that's maybe not as scrupulous as we try to be, if someone's promising you a payback of 4 or 5 years, that's probably not true. I would kick tires with some other companies to make sure that you're getting the whole truth. There's 30% tax credit for that. So Russ's bar graph showing the different credits you can get to offset the cost of your system was really good. And also, as far as a public relations standpoint, having those systems, when we turned on a new one or built a new store, we'd make sure we'd have a press release and celebrate what we're doing as a company, to be conscientious of what the world needs in the future, as well as what it practically needs right now, which is still a lot of gas burning vehicles out there, and there will be for a while. So in addition, one of the PPAs that we did was for a local school that my brother's kids go to, and so that's a way to sort of give back. We sell that power at a discount to the school, so they're saving money, and the system is paying for itself, not super rapidly, but it's just a feel-good thing for our local people here. So yeah, this is our first big system, and it's cranking right along. So we go to the next one. This is probably our second one. It was a smaller store that we built or took over and renovated right here in Charlottesville. And so what we would do differently, I would say that making sure from the engineering aspect, Russ said there's chances that roof trusses may not be strong enough to support a system. The canopies do need to be built slightly different than they would if you didn't need solar. It's not a tremendous difference or cost difference, but it is something that's easier to do when you install it. Conduit runs, roof penetrations, all of those things are nice to think about when you're constructing, and are not huge cost adders if you think about it ahead of time, or if you are lucky enough to have enough real estate where you could do a ground mount, not necessarily on your building, putting in a conduit or a trench. It's easy to bury a tube where you could run a wire in the future. So that's one thing if you want to sort of future-proof your site to think about it well in advance. So next thing was expect less from the utility on the approval and the permissions to operate. So as I was saying, I was under the impression that the utilities were required to have X amount of green power, and that's true, but they want to own those systems and to sell that power back to us. And there are times where it feels they drag their feet on jobs to sort of stifle extra production from solar. Plus they're typically large organizations that don't move at a tremendously rapid pace. So that's why I would recommend getting started in the slower months as far as solar production goes. And then the last thing is just to get multiple quotes. I think anybody that's ever opened up a web browser, if you search solar, the next time you open your browser, you're going to get 45 pop-ups of God knows who the latest flavor of the year or month is for solar. So there's a lot of marketers out there that are pushing it. It's, we'll do it for free. There's all sorts of empty promises out there, and so that's why I think Russ's advice to go local is a good place to start. So I would shop just like any contractor or any project you're doing. I would get 2 or 3 quotes to make sure that you're getting the same story from each individual. And then I would say that going with an EPC, somebody who's going to provide the quote, get all the permitting, do all the work, having it all be under one roof is an advantage. So I would recommend that as well. So yeah, all in all, we're really happy with the process, and excited about the future of this space. And all the jobs that we've done so far have been winners for us, and we're happy to keep solarizing the rest of our buildings.
Taylor, I'm curious, did you have any issues like leaking or things like that from any of the installation?
No, that was one of the first questions that I had, especially for my house that I put panels on. And the connection points that we use to put these racks on your roof are there's very few penetrations, and they're all really excessively flashed and sealed underneath your existing panels. Or if you have a standing seam metal roof, then there really is no penetration, because the clamps are just like grabbing onto the seam. It's not penetrating through the metal itself. And then you've got a few locations where the conduit will go through the roof, and that's where I was saying, if you can think about that well in advance, you can place those in a place where they're less exposed to water, but also less visible, so the whole system just looks cleaner. So of our 9 systems, we've had 0 issues with leaking. And the other piece, to Russ's point, of the pieces that can fail, if a squirrel chews a wire, or if an inverter goes bad, about it fairly quickly. All of these systems come with web-enabled monitoring systems, and I'm surprised at how frequently I check those. It's exciting to see what they're producing, but they can also send you alerts when things die or need to be replaced, or things aren't behaving that well. So the connectivity of everything is really been modernized, is very, very impressive.
That makes sense. And just looking at some of the pictures, you've got them solar on your canopies, which makes a lot of sense, but also at your home office, warehouses, It sounded like anywhere that criteria was met and you had a high utility bill, you could put it in.
Yep, exactly. And that's another thing I would say is that it can be odd if you have multiple meters at a location. Net metering, you obviously want to offset as much of your usage at one site. So to the best that you can, if you can have fewer meters or just have a single, utility area that's feeding multiple buildings, that'll allow you to build a single big array that will offset the entire complex's power usage. Some utilities will allow you to combine all of the usage from multiple meters and offset it by a single system, but some utilities won't allow for that. So that was another frustration here at the office. We used more power at the main office than we do at the warehouse, but there's two separate meters, and so we had to string a wire from the warehouse array over to the main building to help offset that. So that can be frustrating and something to sort out ahead of time if you're trying to build one big array to offset multiple meters. But if you're building something new and can consolidate most of your usage to a single meter, that can benefit you as far as the size of the array you can put on that one building.
Mm-hmm. And then how was your experience? You touched on it a little bit, but in terms of, all right, here's my pro forma, here's what I expect to receive, and then what you actually receive at the end of the day, did those tend to match pretty well?
Yes, they have. So yeah, like I said, I was just checking what my system produced with the Enphase system that's there, and I'm doing about 12 to 13 megawatts a year, which equates to $1,800 a year. And my system after the tax credit ended up being about $18,000, and so that works out roughly to a 10-year payback. And I think the estimate on the initial quote was 9 years. So it's not super fast, but it is rewarding to not have to pay those bills and to know that my house is self-sufficient and that it's not consuming any more than it's producing. I got some trees. My site is good but not perfect, so that's why it's a 10-year window versus the commercial's a little faster because roofs are usually wide open, and if you're offsetting peak usage fees, then you're saving even more than you might in a residential concept.
Jed.
Makes sense, Taylor. And Russ, I'm just curious, after hearing Taylor talk, if you had any thoughts that were stirred in you.
Yeah, sometimes with customers or friends of mine are first reviewing solar, payback is the payback period is kind of paramount. Like they really want to know what the payback period is, and I am not entirely sure why that is, but I know that sometimes it's helpful to disrupt that a little bit. There's no payback, just like if you're renting a property, paying the utility, there is zero payback, and so it's not an apples to apples comparison. Thankfully, in the commercial world, people understand what is OpEx and what is CapEx, and what's an investment, what's an expense. We're really trying to help business owners, building owners, change an expense that they're going to have for the rest of that building's life into an investment and make something of it, as opposed to having a 40-year zero payback for continuing to pay the utility. But I know sometimes people hear 10-year payback, that sounds like a long time, and that's why we try to look at, well, what's an equivalent internal rate of return, and generally that's a helpful way to say, okay, my investment appetite, really 10 to 15%, that doesn't get me there. I need to use that capital somewhere else. So be it. Or 10 to 15%, if I could get that for 25 years with this lump of cash, great, I would do that all day long. Or if they don't have that capital and want to look at financing just for cost reduction, just for operating expense reduction, great, we can do that too. But that's one thing that hearing about payback triggered.
Makes sense. Well, Russ and Taylor, I just want to say thank you guys so much for sharing all your wisdom here on the call today. For the audience, both Taylor and Russ I'll send out their contact information to you, but they've been very gracious to say, hey, if you got any questions, feel free to reach out to them individually. Russ, as I mentioned, is also involved in a solar installer study group, which is new for our company. But I'll also send out the list of the members who are in Russ's group. They're spread at various points across the country. If you're in their area and you want to reach out to somebody, by no obligation do you have to work with them, but could be a good resource for you as you try to explore the benefits of solar in your company. So again, Russ, Taylor, thank you guys so much. Hope you can stay warm as this cold front's been moving across the country. Take care, guys.
Thanks, Jed. Thanks, everybody.